Hey, so I'm going to kick off my videos for this year by doing a retrospective best albums of 2020, and as it was 2020, it will be the 20 best albums of 2020, bit of a theme. We're going to kick off with number 20, Father, and their album Residue. Brought in a lot of elements to its ambient style, different aspects of electronica, a lot of different sounds, and avoided that kind of drony, sort of falling asleep on the keyboard kind of sound. The only reason that perhaps this is not higher on the list because it's so good most of the way through, really interesting vocal samples as well, and having all these other elements is the fact that the final track just kind of stops. But aside from that, this is a fantastic album, really interesting, got a lot of relaxing depth to it, a lot of interesting varied texture which should have just been done to stuck the landing. Continuing into dronier territory, actually does sound a bit like someone falling asleep on the keyboard, was Raphael Anton Irisari's album Peripetia. Had a nice drony vibe to it. It sounded yawning and huge whilst also having a very minimal kind of style. I was very attracted sonically to this pretty much straight away. I came back to it and I kept coming back to it because this album is just so reliable. It does exactly what an ambient album needs to do. And whilst it doesn't necessarily go any further than that, I would say that this was easily a choice for, it would be very hard to leave this out of the top 20 just because how many times I listened to it. Not listened to any of this artist before, but definitely one to keep in mind for the future. Moving into slightly more aggressive territory, Afterbirth, the brutal technical death metal band from North America who sound like a weird combination of something like maybe like the Pyron release, but also having an inflection of melody, but very much its own style. The album artwork has this sort of spaceman, psychedelic, weird MC Escher thing going on, and similarly the music is very weaving. There's some extremely unusual percussive style. It's not just simply thrash beats alternating with blast beats. It was a lot more melodic than you think it's going to be, and there were some interval kind of moments in sort of 1 or 2 minute tracks that have this very beautiful sprawling ocean kind of vibe that I just wasn't expecting. It was somewhat limited in the vocal department. Musically, it was extraordinary to think that this is just, a bunch of guys in a room somewhere. Brilliant stuff. Fantastic death metal album. Really recommend it. At number 17, post-hardcore, sort of post-metal, post-rock band Svalbard with When I Die, Will I Get Better? Svalbard have been really going from strength to strength. They've made a huge amount of splash in the UK scene, managing to both be effective in giving the fans of stuff like Kerrang! Magazine a bit of something to actually like with the kind of post-hardcore style vocals, and a lot of melody, but at the same time having this weight to them. It kind of gives them a nice edge, plus the fact that this band has some really interesting and intelligent lyrical themes that run the gamut of things like internet kind of bullying, sexual objectification. As someone who doesn't really listen to the lyrics very much or listen to music, this kind of had a nice bunch of extras. There's just heaps of sonic lushness. It sounds big, it sounds frosty, very, very melodic and very beautiful. Whilst I think that this tone over the whole album is a bit hard to, shall we say, keep fresh, there were still moments even in the latter stage of this album which really hit home, pretty inspired. Number 16, just keeping it heavy with Thanatos, Violent Death Rituals. Feels like a cross between Bolt Thrower and Slayer, maybe with, an element here and there or something a bit like Gruesome, really big riffs. It does take maybe a couple of tracks to warm up. Super fun, nothing too complicated, songs about death, religious abuse. I like the track Burn the Books of Hate in particular, and a lot of anti-corporate sort of stuff thrown in for good measure as well, which you can't go wrong with. Nothing too complicated, but when something's broke, why fix it? This is fantastic, this album. Listened to it probably over 20 times this last year. At number 15, Silk Money, Attack of the Future Shocked Flesh-Covered Meatbags of the 85. This was not the most obvious choice, I suppose, for like the one hip-hop album on this list. Spoiler alert. This album just grew on me, just over and over, and I love the kind of freshness to the sound, really is important for me as someone who listens to hip-hop, because to me, like, the lyrics and the vocals are one side, but, it has to have a really good instrumental sample track side as well. And this has it. I mean, the album is bracketed by 2 James Brown quotes, which I really like the feel of as well. A lot of commentary on civil rights. This album is angry at times, really angry. There's one track which feels a bit improvised and a little bit slapdash, which I didn't quite enjoy as much, but the rest of the album is solid. It took me a while to get into this, but I think I'm going to be listening to this over and over again, and I really enjoyed it. Number 14, Nothing, The Great Dismal. They really lent heavily into a 90s alternative rock / shoegaze kind of vibe. There was at least one other shoegaze record from 2020 which got got a lot of praise, and I just didn't quite go for that in the same way. I thought the production choices on this album were a lot more, for lack of a better word, canny. I like the sound of the drum production in particular, huge, echoey. It's just everything this album needs to be, and kudos to Nothing. Number 13, similar album in its vibe, a lot of distorted guitar, a lot of shoegaze-esque kind of stuff. Deftones owns. Deftones I've been interested in for quite a while, obviously been aware of them for quite a while. I was a new metal fan back in the day when I was a kid. I think most of people kind of know them as being that band that comes on in rock clubs where they usually play something like My Own Summer, shove it, parentheses. You know, whilst that sound is one style, this current style that they've been pursuing since Diamond Eyes back in 2010 has kind of divided some people. I think it seems to be something where a lot of people either get it or they don't. You know, I really like this more recent style. I felt that at one point that perhaps it didn't take enough risks. Maybe it was also a little bit safe. I kind of went back and forwards a little bit, but then I decided that given the sonic quality of this album and also the fact that it's just so kind of accessible whilst also having this big rumbling guitar just come rolling in on tracks like Genesis, like a huge weather front or something. And when you can just pull out a weapon like that like Deftones can do, you know, now it really goes a long way. I think it was quite easy in the past for me to feel that maybe they were phoning it in with this style, but then you hear their last album, Gore, just how you can pull all that style and pull all that production value and all the rest of it and make the right guitar tone and everything, and it can still fall kind of flat. And yeah, you know, the riff on Radiant City, yeah, it's a little weird. It wasn't my favorite track either, and also the final track does sound a bit like it's cut from a different album despite the fact it's a title track, more like it's some sort of bonus demo or something. But yeah, just tracks like Ceremony, This Link Is Dead, and Spell of Mathematics, these are some quality ass-kicking songs. Yeah, I just think this album's great. It is one of the best of 2020. Number 13. Number 12, 36 and Zarke. Stasis sounds for long distance space travel. Sounds like a guy falling asleep on a synthesizer, but if you do it right, it sounds good. And this sounded really, really right. It's the right length, it's a long album. It's just kind of a reminder of the space ambient artists who've done such a good job with this style in the past. Ben Jordan, for example, you know, Robert Rich, Steve Roach. I just love this kind of style. This is a really, really lovely, just peaceful space ambient album. And, you know, if you don't dig that kind of thing, then, you know, fair enough. But if you're interested in anything I just said, this was definitely one of the best of the year in this kind of style. Yeah, I love this album. Really good. Check it out. At number 11, Juliana Barwick. Healing is a Miracle hinges into ambient and new age, I would say roughly equally. Very, 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 very pleasant, very peaceful, very beautiful, and has, you know, absolutely lovely artwork. Just a joy to listen to. Super chilled, super relaxing. Yeah, another one of those albums that you can just put on pretty much at any time and just, you know, take a break from things. And, you know, 2020 had a lot of that, so this album became one I sort of started relying on. Yeah, it's totally worth it. It's just one of the best of the year. At number 10, Sev Delisa, Shabrang. Oh, this was one that kind of just knocked me out of nowhere a bit. It's such a striking release. It covers trip hop, very particularly at one point, very noticeably, there's a beat which sounds just like classic Portishead. Ambient pop and art pop thrown in, reminiscent of sort of Vespertine era Björk. It's got this great, almost brutal approach. The vocal production is just so in your face. And it also has this inflections of Iranian/Persian melody lines, which just, you know, adds so much more to make this feel like something truly different. This album's fantastic. It's a really interesting album and one I absolutely thoroughly recommend. At number 9, the debut by Irina Sawayama, again, just completely struck me. So out of nowhere, and just this almost effortless fusion of different styles that kind of makes this very glamorous pop record, pulling in elements from early 2000s R&B at the same time, even metal on tracks like STFU. Uncanny ability to kind of make some of these things seamlessly add up, and just as well, just absolutely fantastic melody, particularly on tracks like Who's Gonna Save You Now, and it's just chock full of bangers. It does feel a little bit, this album is quite overdone in terms of the glamour side of it times. But the reason why I think this album is so good as well is just because this is a debut album, and it's a very interesting idea to think that this could just be the beginning of what we might see from this artist. So I'm absolutely, stoked to find out. At number 8, something nowhere near as experimental or left field or fusing so many different styles together. Necrophobic, Dawn of the Damned. It's hard to put into words just how much this album is just an rock and roll spirited extreme metal record. There's elements that remind me of classic Immortal, there's moments that remind me a little bit of the more kind of catchy elements of Behemoth, and yeah, this album just is so damn listenable. I love this album. Genius writing, severely underrated from 2020. In a year which was kind of had a lot of retro feeling metal kind of hark back, for example, the Solicitor record or even the Hell Ripper record. I felt that this one was just nice to see a band who have been doing it a lot longer just coming out and pulling out a classic album. It was just brilliant. I love this album. Check it out. At number 7, Anna Roxanne, Because of a Flower, an album which I would describe as so harmonious and so beautiful, similar to a couple of albums on this list, manages to walk that balancing act between being a new age record and being an ambient record, whilst simultaneously being, on the one hand, not too cheesy that it becomes ridiculous, and also satisfying. Does the things ambient is supposed to do, be chill, but blend into the background and keep you satisfied, bring beauty and harmony to your life. And this album just does it in so many good ways. I was really in love with this record. This is a really cool, electronica album that finds you in those peaceful moments that you need, that we've all needed in 2020. And as it turns out, into 2021 as well. At number 6, Phoebe Bridges, Punisher, dark, indie folk, alternative rock, for lack of a better word. A complete shoe-in for one of the best of the year. I thought this was charming at times, and at the same time had this melancholic depth to it, tackling maybe some not so comfortable issues and maybe not so comfortable states of mind. Particularly on the album Closer, there's this sort of elements of almost a dark apocalyptic tidings, whilst referencing kind of MAGA country North America, pulling those elements into a song and making it add up so well with the feeling of the paranoia, despondency, and the feelings of the idea things might be coming to a head, was pretty much, again, a very good theme for 2020. And also that track has some flat out extreme metal style screaming at the end of it, which is just not what you would expect. And it's just a good album to just chill and watch the world go by. Phoebe Bridges, not very good at smashing guitars as it turns out, but either way, it doesn't change the fact this album's a fucking diamond. At number 5, Suaslvt, and I'm desperately trying not to use the word at the end of it. On Suaslvt's album Draining Love Story, we get a very interesting kind of style. It's a combination of space ambient and also drum and bass. There's also samples which are there to denote or to heighten the emotional depth to what is essentially an album and a back catalogue which seems to be devoted a lot to a very sort of Japanese kawaii anime sort of take on issues like depression and self-harm. It's very bright, it's very loud and garish, but it's also tasteful and kind of has a peaceful vibe to it. It has so many good things happening. There are moments that remind me of classic Aphex Twin, stuff like Goldie, that good stuff from the 90s. It's got so much depth and quality. Great album for working out to as well and going running. Again, something in 2020 we all needed in our designated government mandated exercise time. There may be issues around the name of the band and also the subject matter. There are samples on this which deal with suicide, self-harm. Despite that, it's surprisingly a non-harrowing album for the most part. A solid, atmospheric drum and bass album, and quite frankly, there just aren't that many good ones out there. Just a completely unique style. And it works, it's really good. Number 4, an album, again, I just immediately felt complete, overwhelming good things towards. The German technical death metal band Cytotoxins released Nuclear. A little bit of the same anger about the snare drum, but I think it works. It doesn't really bother me. And this is a technical death metal album, very much in the vein of The Faceless, Necrophagist, and the Dying Fetus territory. It's a lot of notes. At some points, the riffs and the drum switch-ups and the runs of leads that were coming through, caused me to clutch my head just didn't get the respect it probably deserved in 2020. I just love this kind of maximal sensory overload experience that this album provided. I felt like I was having a seizure a couple of times listening to this album. It's got these slam elements, which means that it doesn't quite, just turn into being a necrophagist, masturbatory wank fest, which might disappoint some people, but for me it's kind of like a good mix between, good brutal songwriting and also showing off that you can play really fast and using it to the best ability to heighten the song value. And whilst I'm not a big fan of the album artwork, I immediately just fell in love with this album. At number 3, North American black metal outfit Arkless with Melanoe. A bit of a surprise for me because me and black metal have a little bit of, occasionally a little bit of trouble getting along. But yeah, Arkless really just completely nailed it on this release. Very, very brutal, ugly sounding black metal. This sort of Adol Nathrak tendency of just this intensity, but it's married to a kind of avant-garde sensibility. And it doesn't get too far up its own arse, thankfully. And the whole kind of vibe that they create and that they're going for is this sort of nightmarish, unearthly, eerie, and yet really just hectic sound. And some of the drumming on this, the drums sound like they're being beaten by demons in a cave at some points, and I just think it sounds amazing. Gives me chills when I listen to it. It sounds so good. Proper heavy, great production, perfect in some ways. Definitely the best black metal release in my view of 2020. There were some pretty strong competitors out there, and I think this one edged it by quite some way. And depends what you're into, but for me this kind of style was just what I was looking for. Oh, we're nearly there. Number 2, Napalm Death. Throes of joy in the jaws of defeatism. Napalm Death have been together as a band in this lineup since I think 1992. They have been pretty much plugging away at the same hole for the last 20 years. They've been basically putting out album after solid album, more or less, of very punk rhythmed death metal with occasional sort of flourishes of a little bit of experimentalism, particularly most notably on Utilitarian, which featured John Zorn on saxophone. And this is probably the closest they've gotten to that same kind of style. There's no kind of crazy instrumentation in that sense. It's nothing quite that obvious. But we got a little bit of a hint earlier on when they released an EP which featured a Sonic Youth cover. I must say that doesn't feel quite as experimental as I think we were led to believe, because they put out Belly Full of Salt and Spleen, which is a very un-Napalm Death sort of track. It's quite long, it's quite plodding, it's got a lot of industrial noise vibes to it. I think if that was something that scared you off, I wouldn't be worried, because most of the time on this album it's pretty much the same thing they've been doing for the last 20 years. Just that it's a heightened, refocused version of what they've been doing for the last 20 years. On this album, they absolutely nail it. The drumming sounds fresher than it has done in years. It sounds like the band have just found a new gear. And these experimental tracks that are in between, the sort of stuff that kind of drifts into industrial or into noise rock and even groove metal a little at times, further makes this album pinnacle of what they've accomplished over the last 20 years. I actually was punching the air listening to this at times with just how exciting and how interesting and how damn exhilarating this album is. One of the best Napalm Death records in absolutely ages. A band at this stage to be pulling out something this interesting and still managing to be true to what they've been known for quite a while, and also at the same time trying something that's a little bit different. Absolutely nailed it. Fantastic album. And at number 1, the best album of 2020, Charlie XCX. How I'm Feeling Now. It is so good. It is so emblematic of what 2020 has been like. Not particularly a fan of some of the Charlie XCX material that's been out there in the past. Some of the tracks she's guested vocals on have actively pissed me off quite a lot. This much more stripped back style that she's gone for on this album is a really smart, interesting choice, which gives you a chance to really appreciate what's there in a different way from perhaps you would do from something more ostentatious like the Irina Sawayama record. It sort of feels minimalist, and yet at the same time it's still glossy, it's still pretty polished, it's very inorganic, and yet still feels somehow like you can relate to it in a human way. The genius aspect of this album that impresses me the most is how true to the spirit of what lockdown and what people have felt like in lockdown, this repression of the desire to go out and see friends, to go to parties, to go hang out, go have fun like we all were used to in the past. It kind of gives real feeling to that. There's like rave elements on this album which recall that sort of desire to go out. Me, as someone who isn't a you know, a 20-something going to parties and hanging out with my rich cool friends in LA or New York or whatever. To me, to be able to relate to this, if someone told me that that was the gist of it, I wouldn't think that it would be possible to pull it off. But pull it off she does. Tracks like Detonate, Pink Diamond, Enemy, 7 Years. This album is weighted so well. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It feels like it has got a gossamer touch to it. The melodies and the writing on this album being so sort of effortless. It finishes really cleverly with this sort of rave style, bit like the Blank Mass record from the other year. Big, loud, bashy, and then it sort of segues into a nice fade out, which kind of leads to a alarm clock sound. You as the listener are being pulled back to reality. The reality of being in lockdown in your bedroom, in your house, in your domicile, or wherever. That's why, again, this is the album of 2020, because it's about lockdown. It's about the things that all of us have had to go through. And also, like Enemy, like you hear the melody on that, and it's just like, that's great. Oh, so good. Thanks for watching this roundup of 2020. You know, I set this as a goal, and it took a while to get it out. Thanks for watching it. If you did, like, subscribe, all that bullshit. If you want to do that, I'll probably put out some more videos in the coming year, seeing how this one goes. Cheers!